What's up, guys? Welcome to my guide. The battle system in Thea 2 is very different from the one in Thea 1. There are some pretty deep mechanics, and it can be a bit confusing for newer players. Hopefully this guide can help you to get through that learning curve faster. Let's keep in mind, though, that we are pretty early on in the early access, so there will be some changes. Hopefully the core mechanics won't change. It'll probably just be stuff related to interface and balance. Let's go ahead and attack this snake's nest over here. As you can see, there are a couple of icons on this dialog option here. The number inside of the circle denotes the approximate difficulty of the challenge you're facing, and the card symbol denotes the type of challenge you're facing. There are 6 challenge types total. There are 3 categories, which are physical, red, mental, which is yellow, and spiritual, which is purple. And each of those categories utilize different stats and skills. There are also 2 types of challenges within those 3 categories each, and those are actual battles and conceptual challenges. In the conceptual challenges, you don't sustain damage that you take in the challenge, so the wounds do not stay with you after the battle. You also can't use skills from your equipment. That includes the attacks of your weapons. But you do get to utilize the passives that come along with your equipment, including shielding and any stat boosts. Characters do learn attacks as innate skills when they level up, and those can be used in both conceptual challenges and regular battles. So it is important to level those up sometimes, even if they look like they're weaker than your weapons, because in conceptual challenges you cannot use your weapons. The icon will be solid if it's an actual battle, and it will be outlined in the appropriate color with a black center if it's a conceptual battle. So as you can see here, we're getting into a physical regular battle. On this screen, you can see who you have participating in the battle and who the enemy has participating in the battle. It's worth noting that if you have more than 7 party members, a random 7 will get chosen into your hand. This applies to the enemy as well. If you click on auto resolve here, it'll give you an estimate. For example, here we have a victory with grave injuries if we choose to auto resolve. However, you can just choose to go back and resolve it manually if you don't like what's going to happen. Let's talk about the battlefield first. You can sometimes get a very narrow battlefield of only 3 wide, and sometimes it'll be somewhere in the middle, and sometimes it'll be very wide like this. I believe that 7 might be the maximum width. But in the more narrow battlefields, it's very easy to take advantage of area of effect, but it's also very easy for your opponent to take advantage of it. So it may or may not be a good thing depending on your party composition and your enemy's party composition. When you click on one of your cards, you'll see a list of options that they can use for the battle. Some of the abilities place them onto the battlefield to perform their attacks, and some are instant abilities that are used from your hand. Those are usually buffs and debuffs or summons, where you can summon like skeletons or a wraith in this example onto the battlefield. There are also passive abilities, which are denoted by little blue icons on the cards themselves. You'll see them when they're placed on the battlefield as well, and sometimes you'll notice them on enemies. But this one, for example, is Retaliation, which hurts the enemy's back a little bit when they hit you. Unfortunately, right now, the game does not have tooltips for these passive abilities, so you just have to memorize them, but hopefully these tooltips are coming soon. You can also zoom in on any card that's on the battlefield or in your hand by using the mouse wheel. Next, let's take a look at this area in the middle here. This is the turn order for placing your cards. You and your opponent will alternate turns placing your cards per these red and green boxes. Sometimes you'll get to go first, and sometimes the enemy will get to go first. But keep in mind that whoever goes first does not get to go last. There are 2 pieces of information in each of these boxes. The first is this gear icon, which denotes action points. You need action points to play out your cards or use their abilities. The second piece of information is the delay modifier. So more delay is added the later you play them in the turn order. Delay on each ability is calculated based on the weapon that they're using or the skill that they're using in combination with their wits statistic. So these delay modifiers here just add on extra delay on top of that number. This area on the right here is the initiative queue. It shows from top to bottom the order in which characters will perform their actions, and it will get updated as more characters are added onto the battlefield. These 2 boxes on the right indicate that there are 2 phases of combat resolution. This means that after every card on the battlefield performs their actions once, they perform their action a second time if they are still alive. also important to know that if one side loses all their cards on the battlefield, then the other side will start attacking their hand. There's an exception to this though. Some AoE magic spells will not attack the hand, they'll just fizzle. And after all this is over, then you go to an entirely new combat round in which you start placing cards again. Some attacks can only be performed from the front row, and some attacks can only be performed from the back row. Some attacks can be performed from either row. As an example, I'll place this character here, perform her magic spell from the back row. I'll also place my warrior right in front of her to tank the damage that comes her way. Most melee attacks attack the closest enemy per the tooltips. The way the closest enemy in this game works is like this. The first choice of target is directly in front of you in the melee row. If there's nobody there, then the next choice is directly behind that in the back row. And if there's nobody there either, then you'll attack to the side. If there's one person on the right and one person on the left, then it's 50-50 which side you end up attacking. And if there's nobody there, then you'll attack to the diagonal, and so on and so forth. Some attacks also do splash damage. For example, greatswords do horizontal splash, which as you can see in the top part of the screen here, it will attack the closest enemy and then to the left and the right as well as a sort of cleave. Spears and polearms do vertical splash, which attacks the target and the enemy behind. And warhammers and maces do T-splash, which is like the letter T in lowercase. It'll do a combination of the horizontal and vertical splash. Polearms also do not get their splash damage off if they attack from the back row, but they have the flexibility of attacking from either row. By default, splash damage does only 50% of the damage to the initial target, but it is possible to craft equipment that has improved splash that does 75% as splash or even 100% as splash. Normal ranged attacks, for example from bows, will attack the target directly in front of them in the melee row first, but if there's nobody standing there, then they can choose their target freely. There are also some ranged attacks that can just choose their target freely from the get-go. There are also spells that can hit multiple enemies. For example, the spell that she's using is Ground Shake. Some spells will hit random targets, but Ground Shake actually deals damage to all enemies on the battlefield. It also applies Stun, which is another effect. It means that it adds delay to the target when it hits them. However, that does not persist between these resolution phases. So in order to take advantage of it, you actually have to have lower delay than the targets that you're hitting. There are also other effects, such as Poison, which deals increased damage if their health is already damaged, and True Damage, which ignores shields. There's also Life Leech and Shield Leech, which are pretty self-explanatory. Next, I'll explain the whole mechanic of clones. So I'll end the turn here so that I get some more action points. So notice here that these two cards now cost 2 action points based on this gear icon, whereas the other cards only cost 1. That's because I've already placed them once. If I want to place them again, I can do so, but it'll cost additional action points every time. If I want to place her a third time, it'll cost 3 action points. A color-coded icon like this will show up to let you know that these cards are in fact clones of each other. They are in fact the same character. You can use a clone to get a powerful attack off multiple times, but keep in mind that they can also take a lot more damage because they can be targeted more times. In fact, if they're targeted by an AoE effect, like a great sword or an attack like the one she's using, then they will take the combined sum of all that damage. A lot of times it's best to try to kill off enemies before they can attack you. This is why delay is important. If they don't attack you, then that's also the equivalent of not taking that damage. It's offense and defense at the same time. However, sometimes it is also beneficial to wait until the end, let the enemy play out all their cards first, and then after having all that information, you can take your action. So here, I'll just actually end turn until my last turn here. And now that I know exactly where they've placed their guys, I can take my action. Now this is only viable if you have a lot of tanking ability, which means frontline characters that have high shielding or good summons. Since I am acting last, I know that they can't place any more cards. So I am okay with putting this warrior out here to take full effect of that T-splash from her hammer. And I'm also planning on putting out a couple of skeletons here and here to make sure that these two characters don't get their hits off. Summons are extremely useful, and due to the mechanics of the game, they're almost always better tanks than your warriors. The really high level summons can actually have better stats than your warriors. They can do more damage, they can have more health and more shielding. But also, because they're disposable, that just makes all the difference. When your characters take damage, they'll be either wounded or dead after the battle. When your summons take damage, or even if they're killed off, there's no consequence. In fact, you can simply resummon them in the next combat round. If these two undeads that I summoned had 0 damage, 1 HP, and 0 shields, they'd still be really useful because they'll take a hit from each of these snakes on the side, and I'll be able to wipe out the enemy board on the first resolution phase anyway. So it doesn't matter that they're dead for the second resolution phase because there's no enemies to do damage to me. These summons though actually do have enough effective HP to tank more than 1 hit from each of these snakes. And it's very valuable to have summons that can take multiple hits, especially in the tougher battles, because then you don't have to worry too much about your glass cannons in the back that are trying to deal their damage without getting hit. In longer battles, once you get through the 2 resolution phases and get to the next combat round, you can simply resummon your same summons and they'll come back completely fresh. It's worth noting that your warriors, for example, between combat rounds, they will not replenish their shields. Any damage that they took to their shields in the first combat round will stay throughout the future combat rounds. Your summons, on the other hand, will come back completely fresh with new shields. There are some abilities worth mentioning that persist through the combat rounds, like Inspire, Hunter's Mark. They can raise your guys' stats or lower the enemy's stats, and they will persist to the next combat round, which means that you can just do it to them again, and you can eventually get the enemy's stats down to like 0 damage, for example. Also something like this, where it adds shields. This skill is Protect Others, increases shielding of 1 to 2 selected allies. Shields that you add in this way will persist to the next combat round as well. And as an example here, I'll use this skill, and I'll actually choose 2 clones of the same character, because that way you can increase their shields by a little bit more. I'll take you through this board state real quick. I know that all of the attacks from the enemy in the first resolution phase will get tanked, because the 2 snakes on the side will just hit these undead, and all the other snakes will hit the shields of my warriors. So I'm not taking any damage in the first resolution round. And I know that they're all going to be dead before the second resolution round, because my AoE spells from this character, which are played twice, will actually do double that damage because the enemy has played out clones. So 12 plus 12 is 24 from the 2 AoE attacks, but these snakes that have played out clones are actually going to take 48 damage. And then I have a greatsword and a Warhammer attack also to clean up this last snake. So let's click end turn and see how the battle resolves. It is possible to increase the animation speed, but I'm not doing that right now, just to make sure that you can follow along with the battle. There's the first resolution round. And now in the second resolution round, since there are no enemies, we're going to be attacking their hand. These 2 AoE spells, however, cannot attack their hand. They don't work for that purpose. And now we're on to a next combat round where we can place new cards. As you can see, my hand was reshuffled. I have this shaman now that wasn't in the first round of battle. And also, I forgot to mention earlier that when you click end turn, you do keep the action points. So if you end turn all the way to the end, then you'll have 7 action points to use all at once, for example. The last thing I wanted to show you is the retreat button. It's called forfeit, but it's probably better described as retreat. It's this white flag here. If you run into something too hard, you can just retreat and you'll take some damage, but it's never going to be lethal damage. So there is a way to get out from sticky situations. You cannot, however, retreat in the middle of the resolution phases. You have to retreat before you place your last card. Well, that's it, guys. Thanks for watching. I hope that was informative. And save the video, watch it multiple times if you need to. And if you liked it, click on like and subscribe, and we'll see you in the next one.